The sun was beginning its descent behind the rugged peaks of the Colorado Territory when 16-year-old Sarah McKenna heard the sound that would change everything. She had been leading her father's small flock of sheep back from the meadow when a faint crying echoed across the wind, barely audible above the gentle bleating of the animals. Sarah paused, her weathered boots sinking slightly into the muddy bank of Clearwater Creek. The prairie stretched endlessly before her, dotted with sagebrush and wild grass that danced in the evening breeze. The cry came again, desperate, weak, unmistakably human. "Easy, girls," she whispered to the sheep, dropping the wooden staff her father had carved for her last winter. Following the sound, she pushed through the tall reeds along the riverbank, her heart pounding with each step. There, wrapped in a faded blue blanket and nestled against a fallen cottonwood log, was a baby. The infant couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, its tiny fists waving frantically as it wailed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she knelt beside the child, her calloused hands trembling as she lifted the bundle. "Shh, little one," she murmured, cradling the baby against her chest. The infant's cries gradually subsided, replaced by soft whimpers. Sarah's mind raced. Who would abandon a baby out here, miles from the nearest settlement? The closest town, Millbrook, was a hard day's ride away, and their own small community of 30 families rarely saw strangers. The baby's skin was pale but healthy, and despite being found outdoors, the child seemed surprisingly well cared for. The blanket was clean, if simple, and someone had clearly fed the infant recently. Sarah's eyes scanned the surrounding area for any sign of the parents, but she found nothing. No tracks, no belongings, nothing to indicate where this child had come from. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't leave the baby here, and waiting for someone to return seemed foolish. Gathering her sheep with one arm while holding the infant with the other, she began the trek back to her family's modest ranch. Her father, Thomas McKenna, was mending a fence post when she approached. At 62, he was a weathered man whose gentle nature had made him a respected figure in their small community. His grey beard was neatly trimmed, and his blue eyes held the wisdom that came from decades of hard frontier living. "Sarah, you're late," he called out, then stopped mid-sentence when he saw what she carried. "What in the Lord's name?" "I found her by the creek, Pa," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had instinctively assumed the baby was a girl, though she hadn't actually checked. She was just lying there, crying. Thomas set down his hammer and approached slowly, his weathered face creased with concern. "Let me see," he said gently, examining the infant. "It's a boy, Sarah. And he looks to be about 3 weeks old, maybe a month." Sarah's mother, Mary, emerged from their small log cabin, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. At 55, she still possessed the quiet strength that had helped her survive 25 years on the frontier. Her brown hair was streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical bun. "Thomas, oh my heavens!" Mary gasped when she saw the baby. Her maternal instincts immediately kicked in as she reached for the child. "The poor little thing!" "Where did you find him, Sarah?" As Sarah recounted her discovery, her parents exchanged worried glances. In their isolated community, news traveled fast, and secrets were nearly impossible to keep. By morning, everyone would know about the abandoned baby. "We can't turn our backs on an innocent child," Mary said firmly, already moving toward the cabin. "I'll prepare a place for him tonight. Tomorrow, Thomas, you'll need to speak with the others." That evening, as the baby slept peacefully in a makeshift crib Mary had fashioned from a wooden crate, the McKenna family sat around their small kitchen table discussing what to do. The wind howled outside their cabin, rattling the windows and reminding them of how isolated they truly were. "Someone had to have left him there on purpose," Thomas mused, sipping his coffee. "But why by our creek? Why not at the church or with the Hendersons? They're closer to the main trail." Sarah, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. What if whoever left him wanted us specifically to find him?" Her parents looked at her with surprise. It was a disturbing thought, but not an impossible one. In their small community, everyone knew everyone else's business. The McKennas were known for their kindness and their faith, often helping neighbors in need despite their own modest means. "That's a heavy assumption, daughter," Thomas said softly. "But regardless of the reason, we have a responsibility now. This child needs care, and until we can find his rightful family or suitable arrangements, he'll stay with us." As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she found herself drawn back to the makeshift nursery. The baby slept peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Something about him seemed familiar, though she couldn't place what it was. His dark hair reminded her of someone, but the memory remained frustratingly out of reach. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and Sarah shivered despite the warm summer night. She had the unsettling feeling that finding this baby was only the beginning of something much larger and more complicated than any of them could imagine. Word of the abandoned baby spread through their small settlement like wildfire. By the next afternoon, the McKenna cabin had seen a steady stream of visitors, each with their own theories and opinions about the mysterious infant. Mrs. Henderson, the settlement's unofficial gossip coordinator, arrived first with her usual dramatic flair. A plump woman in her 40s with graying brown hair always pulled into a tight bun. She had opinions about everything and everyone. "Mark my words, Mary," she declared, settling her considerable bulk into the McKenna's only spare chair. "This child is trouble. Babies don't just appear from nowhere. Someone wanted to be rid of him, and there's likely a good reason for it." Mary, who was preparing bottles from their goat's milk, bristled at the comment. "He's an innocent child, Martha. Whatever circumstances led to his abandonment, they're not his fault." Sarah, who was holding the baby while he slept, felt a surge of protectiveness. In just one day, she had grown attached to the infant they had decided to call David, after the biblical shepherd boy. Something about his peaceful demeanor and the way he seemed to respond to her voice made her feel connected to him. The next visitor was more welcome. Reverend Samuel Walsh, a kind man in his 50s who had been ministering to their community for over a decade. His gentle manner and genuine faith had earned him universal respect, and his opinion carried significant weight. "Thomas, Mary," he greeted them, removing his worn hat as he entered. "I came as soon as I heard. May I see the child?" Sarah carefully placed David in the Reverend's experienced arms. Reverend Walsh had baptized most of the children in their settlement and had a natural way with infants. "He's a healthy boy," the Reverend observed, studying David's face carefully. "Well fed, well cared for until recently. This wasn't an act of desperation by an impoverished parent. Someone who loved him made this difficult decision." His words offered some comfort, but they also raised new questions. If the baby had been loved and cared for, what circumstances could have forced someone to abandon him? The third visitor of the day brought the most troubling news. Jake Morrison, a grizzled prospector who occasionally passed through their area, knocked on their door just as the sun was setting. Morrison was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. "Tom," he said, declining the offer to come inside, "I rode through Canyon Ridge 2 days ago, heard tell from some travelers that there's been trouble south of here. A young woman traveling alone with a baby was seen near Copper Falls about a week back." Sarah's heart skipped. "What kind of trouble?" Morrison's weathered face grew grim. "The kind that leaves people dead, miss. Found a campsite. Looked like there'd been a struggle. Woman's belongings scattered about, but no bodies found. Could be unrelated, but—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. In their harsh frontier world, violence was never far away. Bandits, hostile encounters, and simple accidents claimed lives regularly, and a woman traveling alone with a baby would have been particularly vulnerable. Thomas thanked Morrison for the information, but after the prospector left, the McKenna family sat in troubled silence. If David's mother had been killed, they might never learn his true identity, or find any living relatives. Over the following days, more visitors came with their theories and observations. Old Pete, who operated the settlement's only general store, swore he remembered a young woman passing through about 2 weeks ago, but couldn't recall if she had a baby with her. The Morrison twins, notorious for their wild imaginations, claimed they had seen strange lights near the creek the night before Sarah found David, though nobody took their story seriously. But it was the visit from the Garrett family that truly unsettled everyone. Henry Garrett was a successful rancher whose spread was the largest in the area, and his wife Elizabeth was known for her refined manners and Eastern education. They had moved to the territory 5 years ago with considerable wealth and had quickly established themselves as the settlement's unofficial aristocracy. "I'm concerned about the precedent this sets," Henry declared, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his opinions respected. He was a tall, imposing figure with carefully groomed dark hair and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in their rustic community. Elizabeth, elegant even in the frontier setting, nodded in agreement. "We can't simply take in every abandoned child that appears. What if word spreads that our settlement is a place where people can dump unwanted children? We could be overrun." Sarah, who had been quietly feeding David in the corner, felt her temper rise. "He's not unwanted," she said firmly. "Someone clearly loved him and cared for him. They must have had no other choice." Henry's cold eyes fixed on her. "That's a very naive perspective, young lady. In my experience, people make the choices that benefit them most. This child represents someone else's problem, and now you've made it ours." Thomas stood up slowly, his own patience wearing thin. "Henry, I respect your position in this community, but this boy is staying with us until we can determine what's best for him. That's our decision to make." The tension in the room was palpable. Elizabeth Garrett's lips pursed in disapproval, and Henry's jaw tightened. "Very well," he said coldly, "but when this decision brings trouble to our door, remember that you were warned." After the Garretts left, Mary sat down heavily in her chair. "I don't like the way this is dividing people," she said quietly. "Some see David as a blessing, others as a burden or a threat." Sarah looked down at the baby in her arms, who was gazing up at her with bright, alert eyes. Despite the growing controversy, her attachment to him had only strengthened. She had taken on most of his care, feeding him, changing him, and spending hours simply holding him while he slept. "There's something else," Thomas said reluctantly. "I didn't want to worry you both, but Jake Morrison pulled me aside before he left. He said there've been strangers asking questions in towns south of here, people looking for a young woman and a baby." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What kind of people?" "The kind that make Jake Morrison nervous," Thomas replied grimly, "and that's not easy to do." As night fell over their small settlement, Sarah sat by the window holding David, watching the shadows lengthen across the prairie. Somewhere out there, people were looking for this baby. The question that haunted her was whether they were friends or enemies, and what they would do when they finally tracked him down. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah found David, and the baby had become an integral part of the McKenna family. He was thriving under their care, growing noticeably stronger and more alert each day. Sarah had developed an almost maternal bond with him, spending most of her time ensuring his needs were met and marveling at his developing personality. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Sarah was feeding David on the front porch, enjoying the cool morning air, when she noticed a cloud of dust on the horizon. A rider was approaching fast, which was unusual for their peaceful settlement. The rider turned out to be Jake Morrison, but this time his usual calm demeanor was replaced by obvious urgency. His horse was lathered with sweat, and his face was grim as he dismounted. "Tom," he called out, not bothering with his usual polite greetings, "you need to gather everyone, now. We've got company coming, and they're not the friendly sort." Thomas emerged from the barn, immediately sensing the gravity of the situation. "What kind of company, Jake?" The kind that's been asking very specific questions about a baby boy and the people who might be caring for him, Morrison replied, glancing meaningfully at David in Sarah's arms. They'll be here by sunset, maybe sooner. Within an hour, most of the settlement's adults had gathered at the small church that served as their community center. Reverend Walsh stood at the front, his usually calm face creased with worry, while Jake Morrison laid out what he had learned. "There's 6 of them," Morrison reported. "Well-armed, well-organized, and they've been tracking that boy systematically. They started in Copper Falls and have been working their way north, settlement by settlement." Henry Garrett, who had insisted on taking charge of the meeting despite not being elected to any official position, stood up with obvious satisfaction. "I warned you this would happen," he declared, pointing an accusing finger at the McKennas. "That child is obviously connected to dangerous people, and now we're all at risk because of your misguided charity." Sarah held David closer, her protective instincts flaring. "We don't know that they're dangerous," she protested. "Maybe they're family members looking for him." "Family members don't usually travel in armed groups," Morrison replied grimly. "And the descriptions I got, these aren't people you want to meet in a dark alley." Mary McKenna, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "Jake, did you learn anything about who they're working for or why they want the baby?" Morrison nodded slowly. "That's the interesting part. Near as I can tell, they're not random criminals. Someone with money and influence hired them. Professional types, if you catch my meaning." The implications of his words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Professional trackers meant someone with significant resources was involved, which raised even more troubling questions about David's background. Elizabeth Garrett seized the moment. "This proves what my husband has been saying. This child doesn't belong here, and his presence is endangering all of us. The responsible thing to do is to hand him over when these men arrive." "Hand over a baby to strangers," Sarah exclaimed, standing up with David clutched protectively to her chest. "We don't know what they want with him or what they'll do to him." Thomas placed a steadying hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Sarah's right. We can't just surrender an innocent child without knowing what's at stake." Reverend Walsh, who had been praying silently, looked up with a troubled expression. "There may be more to this situation than we understand. Jake, you mentioned the woman who might have been David's mother. Did you learn anything more about her?" Morrison's expression grew even more serious. "I did some more asking around. Turns out she wasn't just any traveler. From what I could piece together, she was running from something or someone. Multiple folks remembered her because she seemed educated, well-spoken, not the typical frontier drifter." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened to her?" "Still don't know for certain," Morrison admitted, "but I found out more about that camp I mentioned. Whoever destroyed it was looking for something specific. They tore through everything systematically like they were searching." Henry Garrett's voice cut through the tension. "None of this changes the fundamental problem. These men will arrive soon, and they'll want answers. If we refuse to cooperate, they might take their frustration out on our entire community." For the first time, some of the other settlers began nodding in agreement. Sarah could see fear creeping into their faces as they contemplated the threat to their peaceful way of life. Old Pete, who rarely spoke at community meetings, slowly stood up. At 75, he was the settlement's eldest resident and commanded respect despite his humble circumstances. "I've been thinking about something," he said in his gravelly voice. "That young woman who passed through my store. I remember her now, more clearly. She was scared, real scared, but trying to hide it, and she bought very specific supplies, things you'd need for traveling light and fast." He paused, looking around the room. "But here's the thing that's been bothering me. She had money, good money, but she was traveling alone with a baby. In my experience, women with that kind of means don't usually find themselves in such circumstances unless something's gone very wrong." Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to click into place in her mind. What if she wasn't running from the law? What if she was running from someone who wanted to hurt David? Thomas nodded slowly. That would explain why she chose such an isolated place to leave him. She might have believed he'd be safer with strangers than with her. Morrison cleared his throat. There's one more thing. I talked to a freight driver who passed through Copper Falls right after that camp was destroyed. He said there were definitely signs of a struggle, but also signs that someone had been there afterward. Someone who cleaned up carefully. Professional work. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If David's mother had been killed by the same people who were now tracking him, then handing him over would likely be signing his death warrant. Elizabeth Garrett's voice shook with barely controlled anger. You're all letting sentiment cloud your judgment. We have no proof of any of these theories. What we do know is that dangerous men are coming here, and they want that child. Our responsibility is to our own families. But as she spoke, Sarah noticed something that made her heart race. David, who had been sleeping peacefully in her arms, had opened his eyes and was looking directly at Elizabeth Garrett. For just a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw recognition flash across the baby's face. Not the simple awareness of an infant, but something deeper. Then she noticed something else that made her blood run cold. Elizabeth's expensive necklace, which she wore constantly as a symbol of her refined status, bore an intricate pendant with a distinctive design. Sarah had seen that same design before, embroidered in gold thread on the blue blanket David had been wrapped in when she found him. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Elizabeth Garrett wasn't just arguing for David to be handed over to the approaching strangers. She knew exactly who those strangers were and why they wanted the baby. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this revelation. If Elizabeth was involved in David's situation, then the approaching riders weren't random criminals or even private investigators. They were connected to the Garretts somehow, which meant David represented a threat to whatever secrets the settlement's wealthiest family was hiding. Looking around the room at her neighbors' worried faces, Sarah realized that the real danger wasn't coming from outside their community. It had been among them all along, hiding behind a facade of respectability and concern for their collective safety. As the debate continued around her, Sarah held David tighter and began planning. She couldn't prove her suspicions yet, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not let this baby fall into the wrong hands, no matter what it cost her or her family. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. Somewhere on the prairie, 6 armed riders were approaching their settlement with unknown intentions. And somewhere in this very room sat someone who was not at all what they appeared to be. The young shepherd's daughter had found more than an abandoned baby by the creek that day. She had stumbled into a web of secrets and lies that threatened to destroy the peaceful community she had known all her life. But as she looked down at David's innocent face, Sarah knew she would do whatever it took to protect him and uncover the truth about who he really was and why so many people seemed determined to control his fate. The real story was just beginning, and Sarah McKenna was about to discover that sometimes the greatest courage comes from the most unexpected places, and that a 16-year-old girl's love for an abandoned baby could be powerful enough to challenge the darkest secrets that people try to hide.